The dim lights of Station Omega's cantina flickered like dying stars, casting long shadows across the metal walls. In the darkest corner, where the air recyclers hummed their endless mechanical song, Commander Vextel sat alone. His massive frame, once the pride of Drekneri military academies, now seemed bent and broken. The ornate battle scars that decorated his scaled hide told stories of a dozen conquered worlds. But tonight, they felt more like chains weighing him down. His clawed fingers wrapped around a glass of Altarian whiskey, the purple liquid swirling like a miniature nebula. 5 years had passed since the human wars ended, yet the taste of defeat still burned in his throat stronger than any alcohol. The tremor in his hands wasn't from age. Drekneri lived for centuries, but from memories that refused to fade. Images of small, pink-skinned creatures who fought like demons possessed haunted his dreams every night. The cantina buzzed with the usual mixture of traders, smugglers, and off-duty military personnel from a dozen different species. Vorthok merchants argued over shipping routes while Zephyrian pilots boasted about their latest runs through pirate-infested space. The universal translator embedded in the walls created a symphony of overlapping conversations. But Vextal heard none of it. His mind was trapped 5 years in the past, reliving the worst mistake in Drekneri military history. Commander Vextal. The voice cut through his brooding like a vibroblade through armor plating. Vextal S. Yellow eyes snapped up to find a young Drekneri officer standing beside his table. The newcomer couldn't have been more than 30 standard years old, barely out of the egg by Drekneri standards. His crimson scales gleamed with fresh polish, and his ceremonial armor bore no battle scars. Most telling of all was his crest, standing tall and proud atop his reptilian skull like a banner of untested courage. Lieutenant Krailsh, 2nd Battalion Outer Rim Defense Corps, the young officer announced, his voice ringing with the confidence that only came from never having faced real combat. "May I join you, sir?" Without waiting for permission. Krail slid into the seat across from Vexel. His movements were sharp and precise, textbook military bearing drilled into him by Academy instructors who had never seen a real battlefield either. The veteran commander noticed how the lieutenant's eyes sparkled with hero worship, the same look Vextel had once worn when meeting his own military idols. "I've been hoping to meet you for months," Krailsh continued, leaning forward eagerly. "The entire Academy talks about your service record. 47 successful planetary conquests. Commander of the legendary 7th Fleet, architect of the Proxima campaign. They say you're the greatest military strategist the Empire has produced in 3 centuries. Vextel said nothing, just stared into his drink as if the purple liquid might offer some escape from the conversation he knew was coming. "The instructors use your tactics in their war simulations," Krailsh pressed on, oblivious to his hero's discomfort. "Especially your work during the human wars. The way you crushed the Terran colonies, broke their resistance in just a few short months. Call it the perfect example of overwhelming force doctrine." The glass cracked in Vexel's grip purple, liquid seeping between his claws. His crest flattened against his skull like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The young lieutenant's words struck him like plasma rounds, each praise a fresh wound on his already scarred psyche. "The recruiters show holovids of your victory parades," Krailsh continued, completely missing the warning signs. "Crowds cheering, captured human technology on display. The Emperor himself awarding you the Star of Conquest. They say it inspired a whole generation of young Drekneri to join the military. Glorious victories that will be remembered for 1,000 years. That word glorious hit Vextel like a physical blow. His head snapped up, yellow eyes blazing with an intensity. That made the lieutenant flinch backward. A sound escaped the veteran's throat. Something between a laugh and a death rattle. It was bitter and hollow, devoid of any warmth or humor. Glorious victories. Vextel repeated, his voice carrying the weight of nightmares. His crest pressed, so flat against his skull, it nearly disappeared entirely. "Boy, whoever filled your head with those fairy tales has never smelled human blood on their claws. They've never watched their own soldiers break down crying because they're too terrified to advance against creatures half their size." Krail's confident expression began to crack. But sir, the official reports clearly state that the human resistance was crushed within the report's lie. Vexthal S words cut through the cantina's ambient noise like a plasma cannon through paper. Every conversation at nearby tables stopped as heads turned toward the source of that bone-chilling declaration. The veteran commander's voice carried an authority forged in the fires of actual combat, not academy classrooms. He gestured at the empty chair across from him with one scarred claw. "Sit down, Lieutenant. Really sit down this time, not that parade. Ground posturing they taught you at the academy. What I'm about to tell you isn't going to be found in any official report or training manual." Krail settled into his seat more carefully this time, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by growing unease. Something in the veteran's voice promised that his comfortable worldview was about to be shattered like ship hull under bombardment. "Let me tell you what really happened when the mighty Draknari Empire, conqueror of 47 worlds, first encountered the species called humans." Vexel's yellow eyes stared past the cantina walls, seeing through time itself to a moment that changed everything. The purple liquid in his glass rippled as his hands trembled with the weight of memory. Around them, the usual cantina noise faded into background static as the veteran commander's mind transported him back to the war rooms of the Draknari High Command. 5 years ago, I stood in the crystal spire on our homeworld of Draknar Prime. He began, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving a nightmare. The walls were lined with holographic displays showing our latest conquests. 47 different species, 47 different worlds, all bowing before Draknari might. The room hummed with the confident chatter of generals and admirals who had never known defeat. He took a long drink, the alcohol burning away some of the bitter taste of those memories. Our intelligence division had just finished their report on a new species they'd discovered in a distant spiral arm. The file was laughably thin, barely 50 pages on an entire civilization. The analysts called them humans and dismissed them as hardly worth our attention. Krail shifted in his seat, hanging on every word. The veteran's storytelling had a hypnotic quality that drew listeners into the narrative like gravity pulling ships into a star. According to our scouts, humans were biological jokes, Vexthal continued. They lived maybe 80% of their short years compared to our 3 centuries. Their bones were hollow and brittle, their skins soft as flower petals. They had no natural armor, no claws, no fangs. Even their eyesight was pathetic. Most of them needed artificial lenses just to see clearly. The commander's crest twitched with dark amusement. The intelligence report showed pictures of human cities, tiny buildings, primitive transportation, laughably weak military forces. Their most advanced warships looked like cargo haulers compared to our dreadnoughts. The analysts estimated their entire planetary defense fleet could be destroyed by a single Draknari battlecruiser. But they had achieved faster-than-light travel, Kralish pointed out, trying to find some logic in the story. Barely, Vexthal snorted. Their ships were slow, clunky things that took weeks to travel distances our vessels covered in days. They used primitive fusion drives instead of proper quantum cores. Their weapons were kinetic projectiles and simple energy beams. Technology we'd abandoned centuries ago. The intelligence division classified them as a Class 7 civilization, harmless, weak, ripe for conquest. The veteran's voice grew harder, edged with the bitterness of hindsight. We had perfected the art of galactic conquest, you see. Our strategy was always the same, refined through 47 successful campaigns. First, we'd arrive in overwhelming numbers, enough ships to blot out the local star. Then we'd demonstrate our superior firepower by destroying a few military installations. Finally, we'd broadcast surrender terms and wait for the inevitable capitulation. It never failed, he continued, his claws clicking against the table. The Vorthok surrendered after seeing our fleet. The Zephyrians lasted 3 days before their government crumbled. Mechanical constructors on Rigel Prime shut themselves down rather than face destruction. Fear was our greatest weapon, Lieutenant. The psychological impact of facing Draknari warriors in their full battle armor, towering over conquered enemies like metal-clad gods. Vexthal paused to drain his glass, then signaled for another. The serving droid rolled over on silent repulsors, refilling the vessel with mechanical precision before gliding away. The High Council chose me to lead the human operation personally, he said, pride and shame warring in his voice. 300 ships, the entire 7th Fleet, dreadnoughts, battle cruisers, fighter squadrons, troop transports, it was enough. Firepower to crack a moon in half. The Emperor himself attended the departure ceremony, confident we'd return with another conquered species in our trophy collection. We jumped to hyperspace with bands playing and crowds cheering, Vexel recalled. The journey to human space took 2 weeks, during which my staff planned victory celebrations and discussed which human worlds would make the best vacation destinations for Draknari nobility. The operation was supposed to be a training exercise. For junior officers, a chance to practice conquest protocols against a harmless species. Grailsh leaned forward, captivated despite himself. What was your first target? A mining colony called New Sol in the Kepler system, Vexel replied, his voice growing heavier with each word. Population records showed 50,000 humans living on a barely terraformed rock orbiting a dying star. They extracted rare minerals for their pathetic industrial base. No military installations, no orbital defenses, no fleet presence. Should have been the easiest conquest in Draknari history. The veteran's hands clenched into fists, scales scraping against metal. We dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 300 warships arranged in the traditional conquest pattern 7. Our dreadnought Eternal Victory took point position. Weapons powered and shields raised. The sight of our fleet should have sent every human on that world running for shelter. Did they surrender immediately? Kraosh asked, though something in the veteran's expression suggested the answer wasn't so simple. We transmitted the standard surrender demand, Vexel continued. A simple message broadcast on all frequencies translated into their primitive language. This system now belongs to the Draknari Empire. Surrender unconditionally or face total annihilation. You have 1 solar hour to respond. It was the same message we'd used 47 times before, with perfect success. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the station's life support systems were holding their breath. Even the ambient machinery hummed more softly, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. But instead of the expected surrender, transmission, we received something else entirely, Vexel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A single video message from their colonial governor. He paused, staring into his drink as if trying to drown the memory in purple. Alcohol. The human who appeared on our screens was unremarkable by any standard. Governor Jamin looked like a typical member of his species. Small, fragile, aging. His hair was turning gray, and he wore simple civilian clothes instead of military uniform. By Draknari standards, he was practically a child in terms of size and strength. But when he looked directly into the camera, something in his eyes made my combat instincts scream warnings, the veteran continued. There was no fear there, Lieutenant. No desperation or panic. Just calm determination and something else. Something I didn't recognize at the time, but would learn to dread in the months that followed. Krailsh found himself holding his breath. What did he say? Vexel looked up, meeting the young officer's gaze with eyes haunted by memory. Just 3 words that would echo through my nightmares for the rest of my life. The veteran paused, letting the tension build like pressure before an explosive decompression. Come and try. The cantina's atmosphere grew heavy as Vexel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. His massive frame seemed to shrink into itself, as if the memories were physically crushing him. The purple liquid in his glass remained untouched now, forgotten in the grip of a nightmare that had consumed 5 years of his life. The battle for New Sol should have been over in 6 hours, he began, his yellow eyes staring through the metal walls of the station. Our tactical computers had calculated every possible scenario. Orbital bombardment would eliminate their defenses. Ground forces would secure key locations, and the population would surrender before their sun set. Clean, efficient, textbook conquest. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter sound of shattered confidence. I remember standing on the bridge of the Eternal Victory, watching our plasma cannons light up the colony's night sky like deadly fireworks. Each blast could level a city block, turn reinforced concrete into vapor. We targeted their power plants, communication centers, government buildings, everything that makes a civilization function. Krail shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The veteran's storytelling was painting pictures he wasn't sure he wanted to see. But something was wrong from the very beginning, Vexel continued. After the bombardment ended, we waited for surrender transmissions. Instead, we got silence. Complete radio blackout. Our sensors showed massive population movements, but not toward shelters or evacuation points. The humans were scattering in all directions into the mountains, the forests, even into the bombed ruins of their own cities. The veteran took a shaky drink, his claws scratching against the glass. I'd seen this before with primitive species. Panicked flight, every individual for themselves. But this felt different. Organized, planned, like they'd been preparing for this exact scenario long before we arrived. Guerrilla tactics aren't uncommon, Krails offered, trying to maintain some sense of military logic. The Rigelian rebels tried similar strategies during their subjugation. Most species attempt some form of irregular warfare before accepting defeat. That's what I thought too, Vexel nodded grimly. Standard counterinsurgency protocols should have handled them. Isley. We had fought guerrilla wars before. The Vorthok mountain clans held out for almost 3 months using hit-and-run tactics. But the humans... He paused, searching for words that could capture the incomprehensible reality he'd faced. We deployed the 7th Legion's ground forces. I expected a few scattered attacks from desperate survivors, he continued. Instead, we walked into a carefully orchestrated nightmare that someone had been planning for years. Grew stronger now, as if the tactical details helped him process the emotional trauma. The first sign something was wrong came when Lieutenant Colonel Threshak led his battalion into the main mining district. They found the industrial complex completely abandoned but not destroyed. Every piece of heavy machinery was still there. Excavators, or processors, fusion cutters. At first, we thought the humans had fled too quickly to sabotage their own equipment. Then the mountains started shooting at us. Hey. Krails blinked, sir. A human engineer named Hyan Wu had spent months converting mining equipment into artillery, Vexel explained, his crest bristling at the memory. Fusion cutting torches became beam weapons. Industrial electromagnets turned into mass drivers that could launch chunks of ore at hypersonic speeds. Even there, ore processing plants were rigged to explode like massive bombs when our troops got close. The cantina's ambient noise seemed to fade as other patrons unconsciously leaned in to hear the story. Even species that had never fought humans found themselves captivated by the veteran's tale. But the real genius wasn't in the weapons themselves, Vexel said, his voice taking on a grudging tone of professional respect. It was how they used them. Traditional guerrilla tactics involved small units making quick strikes before retreating. These humans had turned their entire planet into a single, coordinated weapon system. He gestured with one scarred claw as if mapping out battle positions on the cantina table. A farmer named Yunji had organized the agricultural settlements into explosive manufacturing centers. They used fertilizers, pesticides, even fermented grain to create bombs that could crack Draknari armor. But instead of random terrorist attacks, they timed every explosion to drive our forces toward prepared kill zones. The coordination was impossible, he continued, shaking his massive head. No species should have been able to maintain command and control after losing all their communication infrastructure. Yet somehow, attacks across the entire continent were synchronized down to the minute. A blast would force my troops to take cover in a specific location, only to discover that location had been rigged with secondary explosives hours earlier. Krailish found himself gripping the edge of the table. How many casualties? In the first week? 12,000 Draknari soldiers dead or wounded? Vexel replied, his voice hollow. Against an enemy we could barely see. My warriors' veterans who had conquered star systems were being picked apart by farmers and miners who should have been trembling in terror. The veteran's hands began to shake again as he reached the most difficult part of his story. But the weapons weren't what broke us, Lieutenant. It was something else entirely. Something I still don't understand, even after 5 years of trying. To process what I witnessed, he paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to hurt. During the second week, my medics reported something that shouldn't have been possible. They'd captured a human soldier who'd been hit by plasma fire burns that should have killed him instantly. While they were trying to understand his anatomy, the human regained consciousness. And Krails prompted, though he wasn't sure. He wanted to hear the answer. He broke free from his restraints and fought his way out of our medical facility, Vexel said quietly. Not fought, that's the wrong word. He carried 3 wounded human prisoners to safety, while his own organs were shutting down from trauma. A medic named Dong Su, barely alive himself, somehow found the strength to move faster than our fully armored guards. The veteran's voice cracked completely now. I watched the security footage later. He should have been dead 3 times over, but he kept moving, kept fighting. Not because he was stronger than us, but because he simply refused to stop. When our soldiers finally cornered him at the facility's exit, he was still trying to shield the wounded with his own body. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a normal species, Vexel whispered. We were fighting something that operated by completely different rules. Rules we didn't understand and couldn't counter. The cantina had grown completely silent now. Every conversation stopped as the veteran's words painted a picture of warfare unlike anything in galactic history. My soldiers started having nightmares, he continued. Warriors who had never shown fear began talking in their sleep about human eyes. They said those eyes burned with something beyond mere survival instinct, a refusal to surrender that. Went beyond logic, beyond self-preservation, beyond anything we'd encountered in 47 previous conquests. And that's when I knew we were in serious trouble. Vexel's massive frame seemed to collapse inward as he reached the darkest chapter of his tale. His scales, once gleaming with military pride, now appeared dull and lifeless under the cantina's flickering lights. The veteran's breathing became shallow, as if the very act of remembering was suffocating him. 3 weeks into what should have been a 6-hour operation, my intelligence officers brought me news that changed everything, he began, his voice barely audible above the station's life support systems. They'd located the last organized human. Resistance, a fortified position called Firebase Alpha, built into the remains of their planetary defense headquarters. He paused, staring at his reflection in the purple liquid. The fortress sat on a hill overlooking the capital city, its walls scarred by weeks of bombardment but still standing. Our orbital scans showed maybe 300 human defenders inside, cut off from all supply lines, surrounded by 10,000 of my finest warriors. Krails leaned forward, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by morbid fascination. Surely at those odds, surrender was their only option? No, that's what every tactical computer in the fleet calculated. Vexel nodded grimly. 300 humans. Against 10,000 Drachnary soldiers, supported by artillery, air support, and orbital bombardment capabilities. The fortress had no escape routes, no reinforcements coming, and their ammunition stores should have been exhausted days earlier. The veteran's claws scratched deep grooves in the metal table. I decided to offer them one final chance at honorable surrender. It's better to take prisoners than waste more Drachnary lives on a pointless assault. So I ordered a full communications array focused on their position and requested a parley with their commanding officer. What appeared on our screens defied every expectation I had about this species, Vexel continued, his voice gaining strength as he recalled the pivotal moment. The human commander introduced himself as Colonel Jinho. He was tiny, even by their standards, barely reaching my chest if we stood side by side. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face marked with exhaustion and injury. By all visual indicators, he was a defeated leader of a broken force. Cantina had grown completely silent now, even the background machinery seeming to hush in anticipation of what came next. But when Jinho looked into our cameras, I saw something that made my combat instincts scream warnings, the veteran recalled. His eyes held the same burning intensity I'd seen in Governor Jamin's transmission weeks earlier. Not the desperate fury of a cornered animal, but cold, calculating determination. Like he'd already accepted his fate and was now focused on making us pay the highest possible price for it. Vexel's voice dropped to a whisper. I offered him the standard terms of honorable surrender. His people would be treated as prisoners of war, given medical care, eventually relocated to a suitable colony world. All he had to do was order his soldiers to lay down their weapons and open the fortress gates. Did he consider it? Krails asked, though something in the veteran's expression already provided the answer. Jinho listened to my entire offer without interruption, Vexel replied. Then he smiled. Not the bitter grimace of defiance I expected, but a genuine smile, as if I'd just told him the best joke he'd heard in years. When he finally spoke, his words were delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. The veteran paused, his breathing becoming more labored as the memory overwhelmed him. Said Commander Vexel, "You've been fighting us for 3 weeks, and you still don't understand what you're facing. We're not trying to win this war. We're trying to make sure you never want to fight another one." Then he delivered the message that would haunt every Drachnary soldier for the rest of their lives, Vexel continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "Every step you take toward this fortress will cost you blood. Every meter of ground will cost you lives. Every breath you draw in our presence will be paid for with the screams of your wounded. We will make you remember this day until the stars burn out, because that's the only victory that matters now." The transmission had ended there, leaving the Drachnary command staff staring at blank screens in stunned silence. What followed was 2 months of absolute hell, Vexel whispered. Not a battle, not a siege, but a systematic destruction of everything I thought I knew about warfare. The humans turned their fortress into something beyond a military position. It became a living nightmare designed to break minds as much as bodies. His hands shook as he described the horrors that followed. They used their own fallen comrades' equipment to create false defensive positions, making us waste ammunition on empty armor. Every corridor became a trap, every room a potential tomb. A human sniper named Soyoung took position in a single window on the fortress's 3rd floor and held an entire battalion at bay for 6 straight days. "One person?" Kralish asked incredulously. "Person with a rifle that should have run out of ammunition after the first day," Vexel confirmed, "but she'd scavenged power cells from destroyed equipment. Modified targeting systems from our own weapons, even used reflective surfaces to create false shooting positions. My soldiers couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't even sleep." Without wondering if she was watching them through her scope, the veteran's voice grew hollow as he continued. But the worst part wasn't their tactics or their weapons. It was watching them refuse to die. When they ran out of proper ammunition, they loaded their weapons with scrap metal and debris. When their energy weapons failed, they fought with knives and tools. When those broke, they used their bare hands, their teeth, anything they could find. I watched a human soldier named Kyungmin continue fighting for 20 minutes after taking wounds that should have killed him instantly, Vexel recalled, his entire body trembling now. He used a broken piece of armor plating as a shield and a sharpened piece of metal as a spear. Even after he collapsed from blood loss, he kept trying to crawl toward our positions, still attempting to complete whatever mission he'd assigned. Himself, the cantina's other patrons had stopped pretending not to listen. Species from across the galaxy sat in rapt attention, many having fought humans themselves or heard similar stories from other veterans. By the 6th week of the siege, something had broken inside my own forces, Vexel admitted, his voice barely a whisper. These were Drachnary warriors who had conquered star systems, veterans who had never known defeat. But they started having breakdowns, refusing to advance, crying in their bunkers like hatchlings. I found Colonel Zarthak, a decorated officer who'd led charges against fortified positions on 17 different worlds. Sitting in his command tent, staring at nothing, the veteran continued. When I asked him for a status report, he just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. They won't stop. They just won't stop. Vexel's crest flattened completely against his skull. That's when I realized we weren't just losing the battle for Firebase Alpha, we were losing something far more valuable, the unshakable confidence that had made the Drachnary Empire possible in the first place. These humans had found a way to weaponize their own mortality, turning certain death into a force that could break the spirits of beings who had never known defeat. And the worst part was knowing that even if we eventually took the fortress, we'd already lost the war. Cantina had transformed around them during Vexel's tale. What began as a typical evening of casual conversation and background noise had evolved into something resembling a funeral gathering. Patrons from a dozen different species sat in complete silence, their drinks forgotten, their own conversations abandoned. Even the mechanical serving droids seemed to move more quietly, as if programmed to respect the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Vextel's massive frame trembled as he approached the final chapter of his nightmare. His yellow eyes had grown distant again, seeing through the cantina walls to a moment that had changed the course of galactic history. The purple liquid in his glass remained untouched, as if alcohol could no longer dull the pain of memories that had burned themselves permanently into his consciousness. After 2 months of siege warfare, Firebase Alpha was barely recognizable as a military installation. He began, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had witnessed the impossible. Our orbital bombardment had reduced most of the structure to rubble, yet somehow the humans continued fighting from the ruins. Every day brought new horrors, new displays of their inhuman determination. He paused, his breathing shallow and labored. By the final week, my intelligence officers estimated maybe 50 humans remained alive inside the fortress. 50, against an entire regiment of Drachnary warriors. Logic dictated that we could simply wait them out. They had no food, no water, no medical supplies. Time was on our side. But that's not what happened, Krailsh whispered, already knowing the story wouldn't end with simple attrition. On the 73rd day of the siege, our sensors detected massive energy fluctuations from the fortress's power core. Vexel continued. The humans were overloading their fusion reactor, turning their own base into a weapon that could vaporize everything within a 5-kilometer radius. It was the ultimate act of spite. If they couldn't win, they'd make sure we couldn't claim victory either. The veteran's claws scraped against the table as his hands clenched into fists. An immediate assault? Not because I thought we could stop them, but because I needed to understand what drove these creatures to such extremes. My personal guard and I breached the fortress's main entrance just as the reactor warnings reached critical levels. We found inside defied every assumption about intelligent life, he said, his voice breaking. The corridors were filled with improvised memorials, pictures of human families, children's drawings, personal belongings arranged like shrine offerings. These weren't the decorations of soldiers preparing to die. They were the markers left by people who had already chosen their fate and wanted to be remembered. Krailsh found himself leaning forward despite his growing horror. Did you find their commander? We found him in the reactor chamber. Vextel nodded slowly. Jinho stood before the fusion core's control panel, his hand hovering over the final activation sequence. But he wasn't alone. A young soldier named Minho stood beside him, barely 20 years old by human standards, practically a child. The boy should have been terrified, should have been begging for his life. The veteran's voice grew quiet, forcing everyone in the cantina to strain their ears. Instead, Minho looked directly at me as we entered the chamber, not at my weapons, not at my armor, but into my eyes. There was no fear there, Lieutenant, no desperation or regret, just calm acceptance of what was about to happen. Commander Vexel, Jinho said without turning around. You came all this way to witness our final lesson. Hope you're taking notes. Vextel's entire body shook as he relived the moment. That's when I realized they'd planned this entire siege as an educational experience. Every tactic, every sacrifice, every impossible act of defiance had been designed to teach us something about the nature of human warfare. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to create a memory so traumatic that no Drachnary commander would ever want to fight humans again. Minho stepped forward and placed his hand on the activation control. The veteran continued. As he did, he spoke words that I hear in my nightmares every single day. Tell your people what you saw here. Tell them that humans don't surrender, because we can't imagine anything worse than giving up on what we believe in. The cantina's atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of impending tragedy. Even species that had never encountered humans found themselves holding their breath. The explosion vaporized Firebase Alpha and everything within 3 kilometers, Vextel whispered. My personal shield generator saved my life, but the blast threw me nearly a kilometer from ground zero. When I regained consciousness, I found myself staring up at a sky filled with the ashes of 50 human soldiers who had chosen mutual annihilation over surrender. That's when the High Council ordered the strategic withdrawal, he continued, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. 3 days later, the entire 7th Fleet retreated from human space with our mission incomplete and our reputation in ruins. The official reports called it a tactical redeployment, but every soldier who survived knew the truth. Krail sat in stunned silence, his earlier hero worship completely shattered. The young lieutenant's hands trembled as he tried to process the implications of what he'd heard. The mighty Drachnary Empire, conquerors of 47 worlds, had been broken by a species that barely reached our shoulders, Vextel said, rising slowly from his seat. Not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through something we couldn't counter or comprehend, the human ability to find meaning in sacrifice. He placed one massive hand on Krail's shoulder, the weight of it pressing down like the burden of terrible knowledge. Every other species we conquered fought to preserve their lives, their families, their civilizations. Humans fight because they believe some things are more important than survival itself. They weaponize their own mortality, turned their brief existence into something that burns brighter than the stars we navigate by. The veteran moved toward the cantina's exit, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. As he reached the door, he paused one final time, looking back at the young officer who would carry this story forward. "The humans are expanding again, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Their colonies grow stronger each year, their ships venture deeper into unexplored space, and every night I pray to whatever gods still listen that I never have to face them in battle again." His voice took on a haunting quality that seemed to resonate through the station's hull. Because the most terrifying thing about humans isn't their weapons or their tactics or their technology. It's that they look at impossible odds and see not defeat, but an opportunity to prove that some things are worth dying for. The cantina door slid shut behind him with mechanical finality, leaving Krail alone with his shattered worldview and the chilling realization that everything he thought he knew about warfare had just been destroyed by the memories of a broken veteran. In the silence that followed, other patrons began to whisper among themselves, Vorthok traders sharing their own encounters with human merchants, Zephyrian pilots recounting stories of human rescue operations, mechanical beings discussing the strange compassion humans showed, even to artificial life forms. Meanwhile, the depths of space far beyond Station Omega, human exploration vessels continued their steady expansion into the galaxy. Their crews carried the names and spirits of ancestors like Jamin, Heian Wu, Yunji, Dongsu, Ginho, So Young, and Minho, ordinary people who had proven that the human spirit was the most dangerous weapon in the universe, not because it destroyed enemies, but because it transformed them. And somewhere in the expanding network of human colonies, children played games and learned stories about brave soldiers who fought impossible battles, never knowing that their playground songs and bedtime tales were the stuff of nightmares for alien civilizations across the galaxy. The end.